The African Union, a Pan-African organization whose charter states its mission is to serve and unite the countries of Africa towards peace and prosperity. Who is the African Union really serving? Do the ruling elites have their own agenda? That's today's discussion on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. The African Union, which originated from the Organization of African Unity, the latter having been established in May 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, by 37 independent African countries. The OAU's creation was seen as an expression of Pan-Africanism, born out of a time we now call the New Scramble for Africa. The OAU saw their mission as being to promote unity and cohesion among the newly independent African states, to advance their economic and social development, and most importantly, to facilitate the liberation of those countries still under colonial or white minority rule. South Africa became the 53rd and last nation to join the OAU after electing a new democratic government in 1994 and overthrowing apartheid. The OAU officially disbanded in July 2002 and was replaced by the African Union. The African Union consists of 54 member states, and at its helm is Mohamed Ould Abdel Aziz, also the president of Mauritania. Although the AU's mission and charter is to unite Africa, eradicate poverty, and promote political and social integration of the continent, it more often than not follows the lead of the United States and is enmeshed in global finance and multinational corporations. Its response to the Ebola crisis has been largely slow and ineffective, letting the U.S. take the lead, militarizing the effort using Afrikaans. Later in the show, we will be joined by Dr. Zachariah Mampili, Director of Africana Studies at Vassar College. Joining us to discuss the African Union in the studio is Dr. Nyaka Lagoke, a specialist on African political affairs, development, and Pan-Africanism. Originally from the Côte d'Ivoire, he's a professor in Spanish and Spanish literature and civilization at the University of District of Columbia and a professor of African history at Montgomery College. He founded the Revival of Pan-Africanism Forum, a public forum which engages a permanent conversation on Africa from a Pan-African perspective. Dr. Lagoke, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's a privilege and honor to be in your presence for the great work you're doing.
Thank you very much. The African Union, when it was first formed, there was on the continent and here a great deal of excitement, but it's unclear what direction is it moving. Is it taking the continent towards unity, or is there another agenda?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Yes, when the African Union was created, there was a lot of excitement, and because of the transformation, there were some new organs that were created, the Peace and Security Council and the African Parliament and many others. But what I can say is that the African Union is the reflection of the state of Africa.
In what sense?
In the sense that Africa represents 2% of the world economy, in the sense that there is no strong unity and a continental vision of the development of Africa, despite everything that we heard about NEPAD, and in the sense that many African countries, to talk about those Francophone countries, they are still in a neo-colonial pact with France, a former colonial master. As you know, when those African countries they export, for like 50% of the money has to be deposited in the French public treasury. That's the reality of Africa. And then on the international scene, England, France, many other colonial masters, former colonial masters are the ones that represent Africa on the international scene, even though they may be given the opportunity to come at the UN General Assembly to give some speeches. For instance, in the case of Ivory Coast, when there was a crisis, the resolutions were drafted on Ivory Coast at the UN by France. So he can give you an idea about the difficulties that the leadership of the African Union is encountering in dealing with some international or domestic or continental issues.
But why would the African Union tolerate letting France draft the resolutions?
It is the global geopolitics. When African countries became independent in the 60s, you will know that in the case of France, France decided to grant independence to those respective African countries after the leaders signed some agreement. For instance, what is under the soil of Africa, those raw materials, according to those agreements, the primary country with which they have to do any kind of trade in the case of Francophone countries has to be France. So this is the environment. So if you do not fall in line and then you want to come with your own voice, then it becomes difficult. You can have the fate of Sylvanus Olympio in Togo, who wanted to create his own currency. You can have the fate of Patrice Lumumba in Congo. You can have the fate of Kwame Nkrumah, who was overthrown, the fate of Nelson Mandela, who was in prison because they say he was a terrorist, and you can have the fate of all those people, the leaders, who had a tragic fate.
How do you assess the role that the late President Gaddafi played in connection with the African Union? I mean, he was one of the prime movers in initiating it, but at the same time, this was the person who advocated splitting Nigeria.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful question. And as I've told you when I was coming here, I was reading the book written by Campbell, and he mentioned that, and we heard that. And Gaddafi, for me, Gaddafi was a controversial figure. Mm-hmm. I will not talk about Gaddafi the way I will talk about Thomas Sankara, the way I will talk about Kwame Nkrumah, because Gaddafi brought some wars to many African countries, and in Ivory Coast, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Chad. So Gaddafi was involved in the destabilization of many states in the continent of Africa. But on the other hand, he promoted the Pan-African vision, and in CERT in 1999, he was the one who advocated the transformation of the OAU to the African Union, and he promoted the Pan-African vision. Again, as he was doing that, he asked for this, the division of Nigeria between Christian and Muslim. Mm-hmm. So, but having said that, I oppose the way he was treated by the West, and I think that bombing Libya or bombing Ivory Coast in order to remove Gaddafi and to kill Gaddafi, I think that it was uncalled for. And as I join people like you, to oppose, the NATO bombing of Libya.
Now, let's focus on this issue of Libya and the African Union. So, the African Union opposed the intervention, foreign intervention. Yet there were two problems. One was, or questions. Was the African Union paying sufficient attention to the internal situation in Libya, one? And second, why did their position essentially get ignored by NATO?
Great questions again. Yes, I won't say that they were paying attention because each African country has its own internal problems. And I don't think that the president of a country will expect his colleague to come and get involved in the internal affairs of his country. But I know when there was the uprising in Benghazi, the African Union tried to propose a political situation in Libya, and they did the same thing in Ivory Coast. But to come to the second question, the answer goes back to my first answer, is that whatever role the African Union plays on the international scene is the reflection of the state of weakness of the continent of Africa. They may try to find their own voice, but again, on the international scene, when the West has decided something, what can the African leaders do? And then I remember that Zuma wanted to go to Libya again for the first trip. He went for the first time, and when he wanted to go back to meet Gaddafi, I think he has to cancel his trip because Sarkozy told him that they could not protect him because they already adopted that the no-fly zone that they were going to shut down any plane that was going to be like in the sky of Libya. So this is the environment.
So let me ask you a very direct question. Do you think Africa can unite? It's been the dream of so many of us on the continent and in the rest of the African world. Can it unite, and is the African Union a vehicle towards such unity?
The African Union is playing its role. It could have played a better role, but by organizing some conferences, by using the word Pan-Africanism, by creating the environment for people to work on some project, for instance, the Comprehensive Africa Development Agricultural Program, the CAADP, and then by doing all those projects, there are some people who are thinking about, on the theoretical level, by producing the knowledge that people can use to try and implement a public policy of unification of the continent of Africa, maybe in 10 years and 20 years. This is what they've been doing, and then we have to acknowledge that. We have to commend them for that. But on the other side, yes, Africa is going to be united. And we have to know, and when I talk about the unity of Africa, this is what I say. In 1922, with the Soviet Union, in the beginning there were 4 states. The European Union, in the aftermath of World War II, there were 3 states that came together, and they started the process of the unification of the European Union. In 1776, here in the U.S., the independence, upon the independence of the 13 colonies, there were 13 in the beginning, and gradually they became 50 states. Yes, Africa can be united, but it has to start somewhere.
What about the African Union's relationship to the diasporas? And I use the plural because I was struck when the African Union began talking about a 6th region. And that region, as they initially described it, was the diaspora. And many of us, many African Americans, those that are descendants of those, the populations brought here in slavery, assumed that they were talking about us. And we were excited about that, only to find out they weren't talking about us. They were talking about African migrants.
Oh, do you think they were talking about African migrants?
They were talking about African migrants.
But guess what?
What?
I can see that when it comes to the diaspora, they are not doing the right thing. And so they're not doing anything with us either, because Melvin Foote is closer to the ambassador of the African Union in Washington, D.C. She's closer to him than I am, for instance. And then, but I'm glad, but I wish you could engage the diaspora regardless of our origin, because in the end, we are one. When we talk about diaspora, and we talk about the global African diaspora, you talk about the unity of Africa, you see people as one. But maybe they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And but this is what I suggest to us. I think that if they are not doing what they're supposed to do, it is also our responsibility. We are not playing the role we should be playing. If there was, for instance, a strong movement of the diaspora with African migrants and African Americans and Afro-Caribbean in Washington, D.C. or in the U.S., and they see us as a force, because don't forget, the leaders of the African Union are politicians. If they don't think that there is something they can get in the interaction with you, they won't do it. They're not going to be driven by a deal, you see what I'm saying, right, or by a humanitarian cause.
I've often wondered whether the failure to actually engage the diaspora was also driven by a fear of the United States and perhaps a fear of some of the West European countries. Because think back, one of the things that you see historically among African Americans has been an attempt to connect our situation here with that in the Caribbean, Latin America, and increasingly now with Latin America. And Malcolm X, as you may remember, went to the continent in '64 and was looking to get the support of African countries for the African American freedom struggle. And there was reluctance among many countries to speak out on that situation. So I'm wondering, and hopefully not being cynical, but I am wondering whether part of the ambiguity that we're getting from the AU is political, that they are really reluctant to push this issue of the diaspora.
Yeah, I agree. It is part of the problem. And you talk about Malcolm, that was in the 60s. Right. But I was at a rally, and Minister Luis Farrakhan was talking about his interaction with Mugabe. It was August 13, 2012, and how Mugabe, when he distanced himself from Minister Luis Farrakhan because there were some European leaders who were trying to engage him like in a new partnership. So this is what they do. So and this is one. And second, maybe they're also the products of neocolonialism, of slavery. How our minds were set such a way that people think that in their interaction they have to deal first with whites before dealing with blacks. And this is what we see with the leaders and with the regular people or common citizens in Africa.
Dr. Legoke, thank you very much for joining us for this discussion on the Global African.
Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of the Global African. I'm Bill Fletcher, your host. We'll be back in a moment. We're joined by Dr. Zachariah Mampeli. Dr. Mampeli is a director of the Africana Studies program and an associate professor of political science at Vassar College. He's the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, and the forthcoming Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change. Dr. Mampeli, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go straight to this question about where is the African Union? What's the trajectory it's going on, particularly in light of the origins and the excitement throughout the African world, but now what feels like some level of ambiguity?
Sure. I think if we want to understand the trajectory of the African Union at this point, it's important to understand why it was created in the first place. And that was largely to rectify what were perceived as a number of shortcomings of its predecessor, the Organization for African Unity. Specifically, if you remember the origins of the OAU, there's long been a debate about whether it should push for an immediate political union of the African continent or take a more cautious and slow approach. And after several decades, 4 decades of attempting this slower approach, largely through the sort of push of Libya's Qaddafi, there was an attempt to try to re-strengthen the African Union as a replacement for the OAU. On that measure, the initial goal set out for the OAU was actually for the AU was to recapture some of the initial excitement that surrounded the independence of African states, specifically the idea that you could create a Pan-African body that would lead to the full integration politically and economically of all African states. At this point, about 12 years after the founding of the AU, it's certainly an open question if much progress has been made in that regard.
How do you think that the border issue needs to be handled by the African Union? I'm specifically referencing the ongoing controversy within first the OAU and then the AU about the borders that were essentially delineated by the former colonial powers.
Yeah, I think that's the key issue that has always sort of plagued attempts at creating some sort of Pan-African body. At the end of the day, the key body both within both the OAU and within the AU currently has been a gathering of heads of state, right? The so-called assembly, which is comprised of all the different 54 heads of state in Africa today. And at the end of the day, all of these leaders have their power due to the specific national boundaries that put them in that position in the first place. And most of them are unwilling to cede any of that power to this broader continental body. In some ways, the OAU has made progress over the AU has made progress over the OAU, in the sense that it has moved away from the previous doctrine that dictated relations within the OAU, specifically the doctrine of non-interference.
The AU also did something very different from the OAU, which is that it initially announced that there was going to be a 6th region, which was the Diaspora, and but it turned out that by Diaspora, they at least initially meant African migrants, not so much people of African descent who had been ripped away from the continent and brought to the Western Hemisphere. How do you assess that? And do you believe that the leadership of the African Union gets this issue about the diaspora from the period of slavery?
I think there's some ambiguity on that point. I think if you look at the actual language that is present in the AU Charter, it does take a much broader scope in terms of understanding who constitutes the African diaspora. It suggests that anybody of African heritage, regardless of where they live and what citizenship they hold, would constitute the diaspora. In practice, as you point out, I think that there's a much more limited understanding of who actually constitutes the African diaspora. And again, in practice, there has been very little substantive engagement with the diaspora in terms of the actual political and economic questions that the AU is concerned with.
So in that sense, do you think that the AU is a vehicle for a Pan-African dream?
I think amongst certain leaders, certain individuals who are involved with it, it has become the sort of most clear institutional representation of a particular Pan-African dream. It is certainly questionable now with the sort of death of Gaddafi, whether there's any single figure within the AU structure who continues to push for such a vision. Gaddafi was many things, certainly controversial along many dimensions, but he certainly later in his life really thought that the AU could be the institutional space in which a type of Pan-African dream would be realized. At this point, there's nobody who's really picked up that charge, and there doesn't seem to be as strong an emphasis on using the AU as a vehicle for Pan-African aspirations.
But that's also the same Gaddafi who called for the division of Nigeria between Christians and Muslims and got involved in the heinous wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia.
Absolutely. There's very little that we can defend Gaddafi on in terms of many of his actual policies. But at the same point, it is hard to deny his sort of central role in creating the African Union in the first place. And that, for whatever else you want to criticize about him, certainly deserves some credit.
How would you respond to this question of whether Africa actually can unite? And if you were to sit down with key figures in AU, what would be your recommendations?
Well, that's a very broad question, and I think it's a fair one. In some ways, the challenge of political integration is often underestimated. Mm-hmm. Right? If you look at the situation prevailing in the European Union today, which of course is the primary model upon which the AU itself was based, the EU is facing a number of crises that analysts like myself would question whether it is a durable institution that can exist over the long term, or whether it is ridden by too many internal contradictions so that it inevitably will fall apart. I think the AU hasn't nearly gotten to that place, but it's unlikely that it will be able to avoid some of the same questions that the EU is facing at this moment in its development.
One final question. In the last 10, 15 years, there's been a disturbing tendency that's emerged on the continent where there are those that argue that Arabs are not to be or should not be included in discussions about the future of Africa, and that Arabs are an alien population to the continent. What do you think about that sort of discourse, and what do you think that means about the future of Africa?
I'm very appreciative of an older sort of Pan-African tradition in which several Arab states, I'm thinking about Algeria under Boumediene and Ben Bella, Egypt under Nasser, of course, were central figures in the broader Pan-African and I would say third world progressive struggles. And so I think it's very short-sighted if we start to exclude the varying peoples of Africa and assume that there is some sort of essential way to be an African. And so any attempt to sort of disentangle the Arab from the African, I think, is an impossible approach. And I think that any long-term viable Pan-African strategy must include an embrace not only of the Arabs of North Africa, but also of all the other peoples who have come and found a place in the African context. This does not mean to sort of ignore the long-standing tensions that may prevail between Africans or so-called Africans and Arabs in varying contexts across Africa, but to suggest that if we really are serious about a Pan-African approach, it cannot be based on the exclusion of any of Africa's peoples, including the Arabs.
Dr. Mpili, thank you very much for spending this time with us on The Global African.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm Bill Fletcher, your host, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.